welcome to the third orbit, and this is where we are going to be discussing um, rationale versus logos, and or also known as TE. Oops, that's like a really gross looking E. We don't need to have gross E's like that. And also my arrows are terrible too, but I don't care. So TE and TI. So before I begin, let's remind everybody specifically what exactly is cognitive orbit. Okay, so cognitive orbit, it's kind of an interesting concept, and we've been heavily looking at it within season 23 right now in the Journeyman membership. And within season 23, it's the How to Parent lectures that we've been doing. We are over halfway done with the How to Parent lectures. The next How to Parent lecture is How to Parent INTJs. I think it will be coming out on Friday, which should be fantastic. How to Parent INTJs. But please check that out when it comes. It's going to be awesome. And parenting INTJs, it's not as easy as people think. But we just finished ISTJs, and I believe we're re-uploading the How to Parent ISTJs because the sound on it was terrible, but our video editor was able to fix that, and you guys should be good to go. So yeah, please don't cut any of this. Well, the thing is that this episode is going to be released publicly, and that's why we cut some things out of it. So yeah, just so you guys know, that's why, yeah, so season 18 is actually meant for public consumption because it is emailed out to everybody, but not always. So just be aware of that. Like, that's a thing, and that's why. So, but anyway, but in the context of parenting, cognitive orbit is actually cognitive orbit. Like, we've been talking about cognitive synchronicity, and cognitive synchronicity is literally the theory for cognitive compatibility. We haven't touched the other aspect of synchronicity, where we haven't talked about cognitive asynchronicity. And cognitive asynchronicity, and I'll be doing a 5-episode series on that very soon. And I should actually probably write down a reminder that I should start writing that down. I should actually get my show notes for that. But cognitive asynchronicity, it's when we're going to be talking about like the value of the functions, being polar opposites, and how you can extract as much camaraderie out of that, and why that's actually valuable. So we're going to be looking at that. It's kind of like having synchronous versus asynchronous orbit, etc., or synchronous and asynchronous axis amongst all the cognitive functions. So that's what that's about. We're going to be discussing that a little bit. But in as much as cognitive synchronicity or asynchronicity is actually utilized on a regular basis in our lives, on a day-to-day basis, in terms of compatibility and camaraderie and how to see things from those two different points of view, we use orbit all the time. And orbit basically is this it's like a back door. It's like a hidden passageway between the different sides of our mind, but most specifically between our ego and our shadow, also known as our unconscious or our subconscious, and our super ego, etc. And don't forget, we really do maintain that an extroverted function is not actually real. An extroverted function doesn't actually exist. It's more of a byproduct. It's just like how gravity doesn't actually exist. It's more of a byproduct of what's happening in the universe, etc. Gravity is a byproduct. It's like an observable effect that happens, but it doesn't exist. It's just a thing that we observe, or it's a thing that happens as a result of another thing. Well, extroverted functions are the same way. Extroverted functions don't actually exist. It's only introverted functions that actually truly exist. And it's just because of their existence, then it creates, those would be the yang within the mind, but the yin, which technically doesn't exist because it's the chaos, those are extroverted functions. So cognitive orbit the best way that I could really describe cognitive orbit, and I'm going to get super metaphysical on you right now, is like when you look at the universe, I actually completely reject the idea of the Big Bang. I completely reject it. Um, and it's a serious problem. And yes, it is meta into physical, converting these things. Yes, it's awesome. But I reject the Big Bang. I think the Big Bang is fake. I think it's a complete hoax. I think people should stop paying attention to that. I actually see the universe as uh, an enclosed ecosystem. It's an enclosed ecosystem. Kind of like how, you could, I don't know if you ever like were in grade school and your teachers would show you this giant glass bowl thing on a desk and it had like a lot of plants and water and dirt in it. And it's like, it's a self-contained ecosystem. I'm like, oh, is it? They're like, yeah, it's a self-contained ecosystem, meaning that that ecosystem will be teeming with life constantly, and it's decaying constantly in perfect yin and yang equilibrium, in perfect balance, this self-contained ecosystem. This is what I maintain the universe is. And now, while people are saying that the universe is ever expanding and going in every direction at once, and it's constantly expanding, it's also doing the opposite of expanding. It's also shrinking at the exact same time. And yes, cold doesn't exist. It's just absence of heat. Just like gravity doesn't exist. It's absence of or a byproduct of this thing. That's what extroverted functions are. But really, the best example of this is that if you were to look at the universe and it follows all possibility, all extrovert intuition, it follows all NI pathways basically in all directions. Our DNA is the same way, and I've made this argument before in the past, but if you know what the epigenetic genome is, the epigenetic genome is all of the potential, the genetic potential that our genes, our DNA, can change in real time. So according to epigenetic theory, every bite you take, or every action you take, or every behavior you take changes your genes in real time. It changes it in real time. And that's pretty cool by changing your genes. Now, that's not to say, but the universe itself follows its own genome. So you imagine the human genome, the total potential of all human genetic possibility is actually just a big ring, right? It's just a big ring. And a human being is on, you know what? I'm just going to whiteboard this because that would like make a lot more sense. So let's just do that. So, here's human DNA, right? And then here's Chase right here. That's Chase, that little tiny blue dot, right? And here's Potsy. He's over here. He's the red dot, right? And then over here, here's Raka. He got a purple rainbow thing, But we're all moving in the direction of some kind on this. So we're all moving in a direction. Maybe Potts is actually going in that direction for some reason. I don't know. But I'm following the crowd. I'm going with Raka in this direction. But we are all moving, basically, on this possible genome. So, like, our DNA strands are, going in these different directions, etc. And we're kind of wrapping around this possible genome, this epigenetic genome, and it's just changing over time. So everything that's about human nurture in existence changes our genes on a real time, and it changes our genetic expression in real time. Okay. And then as a result of genetic expression, we are moving across our total human genome potential, right? It's just that within the context of a human life within 100 years, they're not going to move that much. They might only experience maybe 0.015% of the entire human genome possibility within one lifetime. Okay, so keep that in mind, right? So as a result of this epigenetic process, I'm basically making the argument that when it comes to the universe, let's look at the universe here. The universe has a similar epigenetic genome, and the universe is actually right here, and it's moving. It's moving on this genome constantly, and this genome represents extroverted intuition, also known as every possibility, every endless potential, I can't spell. I think whatever. I don't care. Potential, all potential futures, all potential realities. Okay, realities, and then the actual reality. This is SE of here. This is what's actually happening, and then that SE happens, and then where the genome has been, right? That is SI, right? And then where is it going? Right? That's NI, okay? Where has it been? Where is it going? As you know, you see what I'm saying? So as a result of that, we know that the universe is, going in this direction. It's going counterclockwise on this model for some reason, but it's going in that direction. It's moving. It's moving. But how is it possible that the universe is able to move on this genome? And this is why everyone thinks the universe is expanding, within this little model right here. How is it able to do that? Well, it's very simple. So, back here, we have this thing known as white holes, okay? White holes, and I spelled that wrong. Gosh, someone just get me away from a whiteboard. And then we have over here, we have black holes. Yeah. So what is a black hole like? Well, it's like a jet engine. Okay? It's a jet engine. It's pulling. Okay? So this has force of pull, right? And then this over here has force of push. White holes are pushing out matter. Black holes are sucking in matter, basically. So it's like a jet engine. The front end of the engine is the black hole. The back end of the engine is the white hole, okay? The white hole, the push, the source, right? It's producing. It's the source, okay? So the white hole is effectively source functions, also known as introverted functions. Introverted functions, yeah, like TI, okay? Introverted functions, nice. But then you have, the pole, right? And that is the extroverted functions, right? So the extroverted functions are pulling people, trying to pull people to them, trying to pull that source closer to them, etc., right? So this is the cognition of the universe, basically, and it's the cognition of the universe basically moving the universe over total potential, whatever it is. This is why the universe is actually within perfect yin and yang equilibrium. You see? Perfect yin and yang equilibrium. And that's why it's constantly in motion. Constantly in motion. And it is exploring all potential reality. And this is why it can always keep exploring potential reality. This is an Ouroboros, okay? Ouroboros. Yeah, this is an Ouroboros. It's also the Battlestar Galactica saying that I like to quote consistently. All that has happened before will happen again. That is extroverted intuition, folks. So the universe has this engine system of black holes and white holes of pull and push, and is moving itself across all potential. Well, guess what, folks? It's no different for our minds. This is exactly how our minds, go from that direction as well. And it's pretty awesome to be able to do that. So anyway, based on this model, the universe is not forever expanding, because how could this is where I think the laws of thermodynamics actually debunk the Big Bang. And I don't know if I'm quoting Bart Ehrman here, but if I am, please let me know. Or maybe I'm quoting Alan Watts. I'm not sure I'm doing that either. I really don't know. I actually was just thinking about it, but logically speaking, The laws of thermodynamics states that the universe is in a complete state of entropy, but also the universe is also in a state of rebirth simultaneously. And that rebirth, the entropy is like the black holes, it's the pole, but then the push is also the rebirth at the same time. And because the universe is in balance as a result of that, it's able to stay in constant motion, and the universe effectively stays the same size. We're just so small within the universe that we can't really tell that that's happening. Leave that to God the creator. Don't, like, I mean, why do we even have to care about this? We don't need to know this. Maybe we do need to know this in order to actually, develop proper FTL space travel like they did also in Battlestar Galactica. Isn't it kind of interesting that the Cylons would use that guy sitting in the tub and having his brain connected to their ship, and he was constantly preaching all that has happened before will happen again, and yet his entire existence is the faster-than-light drive system for their Cylon base ship to begin with? Has anyone figured out that they were kind of like informatively stating that space travel has a lot to do with the mind, because the universe is effectively following the same exact structure as our souls and our brains and our personas? Has anyone figured that out yet? Or hell, you could even go as far as Frank Herbert's Dune and the Guild of Navigators, and they navigate to fold space, etc. for their FTL jumps. Has anyone figured that out as well? Anyway, the bottom line is that yes, correct. So, desire to reach neutral. Someone in the audience said desire to reach neutral. Yes. Just like our bodies are trying to reach homeostasis, this is an example of universal homeostasis, just like our psyches are trying to reach homeostasis. And this is a point that Mr. Chris Taylor actually had brought up to me recently when his discussion about the superego, and that the superego is trying to challenge the ego, and it doesn't have respect for the ego, like I've said previously. But I think that is because the superego is on a mission by providing its challenge. It represents the yin, while the ego represents the yang within the psyche, and it represents the pull, while the ego represents the push, basically. And because it's doing that, our brains are working very similarly to the actual drive system of the universe at the same time. Pretty awesome, right? But this black hole to white hole system, folks, it literally is. That is what cognitive orbit is. That is exactly what cognitive orbit is. It's the black hole, the extroverted function, and its direct link and pathway and conduit into the introverted function, or vice versa. It could be it's not just a one-way street. It's a two-way street. No, I'm not. I don't think I'm a monist. I don't know why anyone are bringing that up. So I don't see that at all. I think the universe can have all potential, etc. I mean, push and pull, etc. I don't think. Let me actually just define monism here. Define monism, just to make sure that I'm correct. So monism. The view in metaphysics that reality is a unified whole and that all existing things can be ascribed or described by a single concept or system. No, I think it's a series of systems and a series of concepts. The doctrine that mind and matter are formed from or reducible to the same ultimate substance or principle of being. That's what string theory is based on. I don't agree with that, because I think trying to like look for the Higgs boson or like the God particle or string theory, etc. And I think that's very has monistic roots within it, but no, I don't agree with that either. Any system of thought which seeks to deduce all the varied phenomena of both the physical and spiritual worlds from a single principle, specifically the metaphysical doctrine that there is but one substance, either mind idealism or matter materialism, or a substance that is either mind nor matter but the substantial ground of both. I think we are in a dualistic system. So, especially from, I am a Taoist. I don't subscribe to monism. That being said, I can see how monism technically would have some merit because you could make the argument like there's no such thing as cold, there's only absence of heat, so heat is the only thing that actually exists, so cold doesn't exist and heat is one thing, which would technically logically prove that monism is true. But I guess it just depends if you really want to say that black holes really exist, or if you really want to say that extroverted functions really actually exist. If they really do exist, if gravity really does exist, then you would be able to make the argument that it's actually dualism. But which, because of the masculine and the feminine, I kind of subscribe to that because I do maintain they're both real. And where you have the concrete and the abstract at the same exact time, therefore you could say that, well, concrete is the only thing that exists. But honestly, that's very reductionist. That's very Occam's razor, and that can actually lead to ignorance. And I don't want to take that risk. So as a result of that, I have to err on the side of caution and actually subscribe to the dualistic view of the universe and not a monistic view of the universe. To answer your question, good sir in the audience, thank you for asking. Uh, so anyway, what if string theory is the concrete push to the abstract anypool? Yes, that's what I'm saying, Raka. Yes, I agree with that. And the concrete SE push to the abstract. Yes, I agree with that. So anyway, but the point is that while the universe is in a constant state of entropy and we have a law of diminishing returns, the universe is also in a constant state of rebirth, and then we have the law of accelerated returns. If you want to learn more about the law of accelerated returns, read Ray Kurzweil in his book about the coming singularity. Also, I would like to state that I am not a transhumanist. I'm actually against transhumanism. So, like, that's a thing. Please be aware of that thing. So anyway, so using this as a model, I just want you guys to know, like, looking at the universe and the metaphysics involved here, cognitive orbit follows roughly the same exact pattern. And when you're looking at, the four sides of the mind, you have to see our four sides of the mind as our own inner internal universe, basically. Just like, and this is where you can get into the, if you go watch episode 1 of season 17, where I talk about the source of all cognition, you could effectively make the argument that the source of all cognition, also known as God the Creator, etc., if God the Creator really exists, then we are perhaps maybe a figment of His imagination. And then we each are a puzzle piece of that imagination, such that we have our own inner universe. Also, I really love the song by Ortega, composed by Yoko Kanno, who is the intro song to Ghost in the Shell standalone complex, also titled Inner Universe. It is the dopest. You might want to check that out. So anyway, that being said, cognitive orbit literally is following the identical logic in terms of how it works mechanically within our mind. So let's actually do that, and we're going to be let's look at an INTJ. Let's look at an INTJ right now on this. So we're going to do an INTJ, and who else should we do? Let's do an ESTP. Yeah, let's do an ESTP. Doing something interesting about these two types. So let's get some INTJ going. INTJ, we have NI, we have TE, we have FI, we have SE, we have NE, we have TI, we have FE, and we have SI for its cognitive functions. Then we're going to do an ESTP over here. Then we have SE, and then we have TI, and then we have FE, and then we have NI. That's a horrible NI. I regret making that. And then we have SITE, FI, and E. Okay. So we have two people here on our board. So yeah, um, yeah. No, the thing is though, Dio, is that you can still prove things exist without concrete evidence. For example, a lot of what is unknown within our race and whatnot, because actually recently they proved Einstein's theory of relativity to be true. And they did this by observing a binary star system adjacent to a black hole. And they took pictures of it, and they were able to actually track how the light bended up from the stars, bended around the black hole. And because they were able to observe that, it literally proved Einstein's theory of relativity, basically. But there was no way to prove it. They just stumbled upon being able to prove it later, which means extroverted intuition in conjunction with either extroverted thinking or introverted thinking, but especially introverted thinking, it is actually possible using logic alone to prove it, even if you don't have any concrete evidence. If all you have is abstraction, you can still observe the metaphysical world through abstractive perception using extroverted intuition, even introverted intuition. And then if you are still following a logical system, you actually can prove that it is true and know that it is true, even though you can't actually bring those metaphysics into the concrete. Until recently, our race has not been able to prove that the theory of relativity is true, but they actually did, and they did about 2 years ago. So that is a pretty awesome approach. Yeah, well, the time study with two clocks is one thing, but being able to observe the light, and if you're traveling at the same speed as light, are you blind basically because you literally can't see anything because you're traveling at the exact same speed and it's completely and totally dark? That would make sense. You'd have to travel faster to be able to see again, or slower to be able to see again. If you're traveling at the same speed, you can't see anything, right? So it's kind of like the reverse Doppler effect. It's kind of interesting how that works mechanically. But cognitive orbit, has a different approach. So remember, folks, we're discussing extroverted thinking to TI and what this specific orbit actually looks like. Now, the reason why I chose these two types is because when you look at these two types, you have a parent function here, and then you have a critic function here. And what's interesting about the parent, whenever you have functions that are in the parent and critic, they actually form an orbit of some kind. And then, it's no different. It's no different here. Here's the parent, and here's the critic. And this is very special within this particular orbit. The reason why is when you have a function in the parent function slot necessary, because of how pessimistic these functions are, they're very, very pessimistic. They are sharper. They have higher accuracy. They have higher accuracy as a result. They're not being too optimistic because optimistic functions, they tend to make, for example, they tend to make leaps. They can be arrogant, so like leaps of logic, for example, or leaps of rationale, or they're very arrogant. They take it too far. Optimistic functions, they could take it too far, right? And just looking at the ego versus unconscious here, just for simplicity reasons, because explaining this from a subconscious to a superego approach is pretty difficult. But looking at it here, like a hero function, so like NI-hero with what it wants, it can be like really impulsive versus an NI-parent. While still impulsive, at least it's responsible. So the pessimism allows for parent and critic functions to be more accurate than their other functional counterparts. This is why I like to call this a capacity for mastery, okay? So these two types are masters of thinking. Now, I understand that we call the trickster function in its super mature form the master function. That's what I'm talking about. That's not what I'm talking about. Obviously, that would be even stronger from a mastery standpoint, but all Are things in two different states at the same time when not observed? I don't know. So based on that, these two things have mastery of thinking. So rationale and TI, which means an INTJ can use TE and TI. They could use them interchangeably. It just takes them a lot more practice and a lot of time to actually get to the point where they're able to use their TI, pretty effectively, right? Just like an ESTP has TE critic. So they're able to have more thinking. But if you look at, like, let's imagine if there was like an ISTP. Let's look at an ISTP over here, right? TISENIFE on this side, and then you have TE, and then TE, and then you have SI, you have NE, and then you have FI on this side. What's the problem? What's the problem with TI Hero and TE Nemesis? Well, they're both optimistic, and the thing is that the ISTP can make leaps of logic, and it's because it makes leaps of logic because it's more prone to ignorance. TI Hero is more prone to ignorance. It has a higher risk of ignorance than TI Parent, right? Than this TI Parent over here. The reason why, and remember what the ignorance of TI actually is, it is preferred input or last known input, right? Preferred input versus last known, okay? And this leads to ignorance, but optimistic functions, because these functions are trying a lot harder. Pessimistic functions don't try as hard, but optimistic functions do try a lot harder. And this is why an ISTP is not necessarily a master of thinking, because from an ISTP standpoint, that TI Hero, it makes leaps of logic. It thinks it becomes accustomed to being the hero. It's way too accustomed to being the hero. And oftentimes, this causes the TI Hero to jump to conclusions. But a TI Parent, the ESTP, it's not going to jump to conclusions as often. The TI Parent is more responsible. The TI Parent relies less on preferred input or less on last known input compared to a TI Hero. And while the TI Hero is technically on paper the best processor or potentially the most intelligent of all the types, the problem is, though, is that the TI Parent still has a higher chance of being more correct and more accurate than the TI Hero. And that's why, the hero often adheres to the parent a lot for advice, etc. It's kind of like Superman always going back to Smallville and, trying to talk to his, or going back to the Fortress of Solitude and having a conversation with his father, Jor-El, in the crystals, etc. Because it provides him, with needed advice, etc. Because the hero can't always do everything on their own. They need the parent, because the hero ends up taking it way too far. And they are at risk of making these huge leaps or becoming arrogant. And using TI as an example right now, it has higher preferred input versus last known input, etc. So, no, it doesn't have to be paired with ignorance. It can be infantile or broken, but again, you start getting into the risk of, like, hey, are they cognitive transitioning right now? Is that actually happening? Or is it activating through an orbit instead of a transition? So, like, there's a lot of questions that come up with asking that question in response. So I can't really answer it for sure because there's other variables that have to be tracked while you're doing this. So anyway, the point is that, when you're looking at the third orbit in this particular model, it's really just important to understand that when you have parent functions in an orbit with their critic, they end up being the most effective. They have the highest efficacy for that form of cognition better than other people. This is why ETPs and ITJs are what I call the four masters of thinking. ISTJ, INTJ, ESTP, ENTP. Those people literally have the monopoly on thinking. But then if you look at an ENFP, they have monopoly on feeling. So then you have EFPs, having a monopoly on morality and ethics, just like also IFJs, have that monopoly on feeling as well, because they're keeping those functions pessimistic, those decision-making functions, pessimistic in there. So, uh, yeah, and so as a result of that, there's some issues there, as a result. I don't. Okay, hold on. I don't think that is one reason why ISTPs are better than tacticians and ESTP. Now, I could be jumping to a conclusion about what you're saying, and I apologize ahead of time. But SE Hero, or yes, I'm sorry, I got that backwards. Yes, I agree. Because SE parent, in terms of, the ISTP ends up becoming like part of the masters of sensing, the ISTP is more likely to be able to unobligate themselves from something than an ESTP, because their extroverted sensing parent is more pessimistic. It is more effective, right? So parent functions are more effective, right? Which means critic functions would technically be more effective as well. You do not have this benefit when you're looking at the hero to nemesis approach. So just realize, while it takes a little bit more mental energy to utilize the pessimistic functions of your parent and your critic, they are more effective. Um, so so yeah, that is a thing. So yeah. So I wanted to make this distinction first before continuing on into going into the actual orbits here. So I'm going to erase some of these things to make some space here for us. So let me do that. Okay, let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of all this. We don't need this. Come on. Okay. All right, let's actually just get rid of these. I don't need this ISTP up here anymore. Okay. It's kind of interesting if you think about it, because when you look at masters of perception, which would be parent-critic functions for perceiving functions, and then you have the masters of sensing between the SI parents and the SE parents, but then you look at the masters of intuition between NE parents and NI parents. Those types, it's funny, I have any hero, and like my seeing, my prescience can be overreaching. Like I can over prognosticate, I can over predict, I can over conjecture, basically, and it's not as accurate. My conjecture is not as accurate. And that's why I've like hired INTPs or INFPs on my team, just specifically to ask their any parent, okay, so what do you think is actually going to happen here? And they're taking my any hero to school. It's great seeing a parent really taking a hero to school. It happens all the time. So, but anyway, so cognitive orbit is super, super important. So like using parenting as an example, but it could be useful for anything. Extroverted thinking to introverted thinking, or introverted thinking to extroverted thinking, we have two different pathways, and they can go down and they can go up. It's a two-way street where information is being moved between other things. Now, the problem is that like when we look at parenting, when an ego gets older, it starts protecting itself. These functions start protecting themselves, and they are protecting their ego investments. And this is one thing that the superego doesn't like that the ego does, is that it sees that the ego gets invested in things, and the superego is constantly trying to challenge the ego and to remove its ego investments. Because it's like the ego investments don't really mean that much. They don't really mean that much. And one of the ways that it does this is it does this by doing a cognitive transition itself directly into the unconscious, and and then accesses the back end, the back doors basically into the ego. And cognitive, and that's where, but then again, not only that, the ego can actually access the superpowers of the superego by utilizing, its backdoors directly into the superego as well. And one of the ways that I've done this personally is create an SI inferior habit through my extroverted sensing demon to access my extroverted sensing demon, my ESFP demon's interest awareness in order to protect my SI inferior in a reverse way. Because usually when someone's inferior function gets hit, the superego activates to come to the aid of the inferior child. It's just like that trope where there's like a baby, left for dead out in the wilderness, and it just happens to be left for dead out in like a barren wasteland, and the great demon actually ends up taking the child and raising the child as its own. And actually, a really good example of this in popular culture is Game of Thrones. And if I remember correctly, it might be at the end of season 2 or season 3, but one of Craster's sons are being sacrificed to the White Walkers, also known as the Others. You can see that the great evil of the land, who is the Night King, starts turning that baby into one of them, basically. And that's an example of the great evil of the superego coming over, to the inferior and granting its super amazing, demonic, mystical, divine powers upon the infant child, basically. And that's what happens when you hit someone's inferior and their superego activates to come to the aid of the inferior function, as a result. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because a person could actually utilize cognitive orbit to get into, that there. So and since we're using, TI and TE, we can do that again right here. Let's look at an ENFJ, for example, since we're picking on Templars tonight for some reason. So we have an ENFJ right here, and okay, and so, and then you have the TE demon of like, no one's opinions ever. No one gets opinions. I'm not going to listen, blah, blah, blah. And then you have this TI truth, right? And then someone's like, oh, you're stupid. You're stupid, right? And, and then the TI activates and it goes down through cognitive orbit to the demon, which is the gateway into the superego, right? It's the gateway into the superego. And then as a result of that gateway, it, all of a sudden it's able to send its superpowers up to the TI function and give it that way. Where the TI function basically, in order to bolster its truth, it's utilizing the demonic opinion, basically, and then it's able to do it from there, and it's able to, protect, the infant, because the superego sometimes is like, wow, where's the NI parent taking care of the infant inferior function? Oh, it's not doing its job. So, or it did do its job, but it failed. Okay, and the infant was left in the barren wasteland in my domain. Left in my domain. And the superego is like, okay, this ESTJ superego is like, fine, then I will take this little TI inferior and I will become its master, its professor, and teach it the ways and grant my powers upon this very weak infant child, just like in Game of Thrones, basically. So this is the same thing. It's the same approach, as a result, So this is the value of cognitive orbit. This is what it's able to accomplish, and this is an example of how opinion can, be supported with truth. Because what's really important about opinion is that truth. I just wanted you to say truth or logos. It's proof. But you can't really have proof without evidence, right? So what this ENFJ ends up learning, it starts to learn that in order for people to listen to their truth and not to have their TI inferior stomped on, they end up learning how to gather evidence. And to guarantee that their infant is protected, they end up bolstering their inferior with additional evidence to make sure that no one else will challenge their TI inferior ever again, right? This is an example of cognitive orbit, okay? This is why I stated in the SISE first cognitive orbit lecture that we did 2 lectures ago about with my own introverted sensing. That's how I developed the habit. I am triple systematic. That puts me at severe risk. My superego hates it when other people are taking advantage of it. In fact, I had a really great phone conversation with my INTP friend Vicky like last night, and she, thank God. For a second there, I thought I'd finished that. So she told me something really, really important. She's like, Chase, you really need to make sure that you're taking care of baby Chase. You got to take care of you, your infant inside of your mind, your inferior function. And I could tell that you're not. I could tell that you're often doing Craster's child sacrifice. I'm inserting that in there because that's what Craster is doing. The child being sacrificed in the North to protect Craster's ego investments, his way of life with his harem of women, etc., at his home north of the wall, and that's his ego, that's his environment, that's his ego. In order to protect his ego, he has to continuously sacrifice his infant sons, his inferior function, okay? It's the same concept, making that sacrifice. Just like I have to sacrifice my SI when I'm constantly being loyal to church or loyal to women I shouldn't be loyal to, or loyal to addictions I shouldn't be loyal to, or loyal to experiences I shouldn't be loyal to, or loyal to systems or ways of thinking or social norms or organizations or ideals I shouldn't be loyal to, right? My superego's like, what the hell? You shouldn't be loyal to that. And the superego's like, fine, you have all those stupid ego investments. I'm going to come and destroy you and wipe you out. The White Walkers are going to come and destroy you and wipe Craster out of Craster's keep. And so instead of doing that, he's like, I'm just going to sacrifice my infant inferior function to you instead. And then the superego's fine. I'll take your inferior and then I'll make it my own. You see, that's an example of cognitive orbit directly within our extroverted intuition tropes, hero's journey, and mythology right there. Game of Thrones is a mythos. The Song of Ice and Fire is a mythos, okay? So this is literally how this happens mechanically within our heads on a daily basis, okay? When you're looking at, the superego as a result. So this is a thing, okay? So cognitive orbit, you have to be aware that there is, some limitations as a result. Well, I don't know if it's limitations, but when you're looking at other types, like other than ENFJs, if you were to take a like an INTJ and whatnot, they end up. Their orbit is like this, is that I gotta know the truth, I gotta know the truth, I gotta know the truth. That critic is demanding the truth because the superego is trying to pull hard towards the ego, pull the ego down to itself so it could hopefully replace the ego, basically. But it's doing this through the influence of the unconscious, and it's trying to get, and it could also do it through the influence of the subconscious, but that's another discussion later. That's actually more cognitive axis than it is cognitive orbit. But by doing this, through cognitive orbit, on the lower side of the mind, the lower 4 functions, the unconscious, as it were, doing the unconscious and doing it that way, it's because it's trying to get those energies, and those are the back doors between, to the ego itself. So the INTJ is like, oh, hey, I need to go gather, I need to have evidence, I have to have an amazing opinion. But the thing is that the orbit's like, well, wait a minute. How do I know my opinion's actually true? What if my opinion's not true? What do I do there? You know, and that could be a serious problem. How do I know? How do I know my opinion is correct? How do I know my TE opinion is true? So what happens is that when you have this orbit, this TI critic, they're very critical. They're very, you know, almost like grandparents, or they're very senile elders. And the senile elder, it's like, okay, I know the truth. I know the truth, but I forgot. I need to know the truth again, but I forgot. I need to know the truth again, but I forgot. And that can be very difficult for an INTJ. It's one of the reasons why it doesn't matter how many times they take the Discover test at csjoseph.life/discover, that they end up hiring me for a typing session anyway, because they're like, I just need to know, I just need to know, I just need to know. I need to gather evidence. I need something external to validate what I already know is true, because their ego wants to have its ego investments, right? Because the TE is not satisfied, even though the test and and everything they have up there is telling their TI, okay, yes, I know I'm an INTJ, I know I'm an INTJ, but the TE is like, but you don't have any external evidence for that, right? And it's a problem. It's a huge problem. So yeah, Andy Chow calls it the research positive feedback loop. It never ends. It really never ends. Yeah, what's in the basement? Okay, yeah. And you reap what you sow. Yes, exactly. So it's a problem. It's a serious problem for this cognitive orbit. But really, it comes down to, like, in order to have a complete view of truth, you can't. You have to look at TE and TI as, you know, oh, this is the pathway by which we get to truth overall. You know, how to get there, you know, and what we're getting there with is a little bit different. You have to have both. You really, really have to have both. Because here's the thing, like, you look at an ENFJ or an ESFJ, they have TI inferior, they have TE demon, you know, or they're not really going to have as much truth awareness. Now, a TI child will have a little bit more, because TI, its logos is logical. You can arrive to a truth regardless of the input that it's working with. But being able to gather input at the same time, or gather evidence at the same time, and then extract truth from that through, you know, processing that input or that evidence, it's going to have a higher chances of arriving to a truth conclusion. So really, I often say that TI is like truth oriented. It's technically not. It's more of like facts, you know, or concrete facts, right? Whereas TE is more actually abstract facts. They're abstract. They're abstractions. So, and you have abstract factions, and then the TI turns into concrete, and then the result is truth, basically. You know, and it works in that direction. But if you don't understand, you know, truth, you know, from that standpoint, and this is why, you know, like, I'm like, yeah, TI users, they're closer to the truth. Yes, they are closer to the truth. They have the TI facts, because all the TE users around them, they could still grab those abstract facts, or those TE users are going to provide those abstract facts to the TI users to turn them into concrete facts, and then it's over, and then the TI users are the ones who ends up knowing the truth. They end up holding the truth. They end up being the source of truth as a result. But still, those concrete facts still require the abstract facts first in order for them to reach those conclusions to begin with. And it goes both ways, you know, because you have an INTJ who's all about having those abstract facts, gathering up of this evidence. It's kind of like what my friend Alex, he's an ESTP, he says conspiracy theories are two things. A conspiracy theory is a story without evidence, which is a TI without TE, or it is evidence without a story. It's a bunch of TE without TI, essentially, right? And that is what this cognitive orbit is all about. That's literally what it means. So TI child is most likely to achieve concrete facts. I kind of think TI parent is the most likely to achieve concrete facts. However, TI child is so innocent with the concrete facts that it has the because they lack extroverted thinking so much, and they lack their ability. Because here's the problem with TI child: TE trickster within its cognitive orbit, TE Trickster absorbs, and it is willing to listen to anybody. It's willing to listen to anything. It's willing to gather up any evidence, even if that evidence is fake. It wasn't gathered in a responsible way. They will look at any evidence, and then they will process any evidence. So their output that comes up, their FE output, because remember, you have that process of TE, TI, FE, FI, input, process, output, feedback, in that order, which is what we first started with at the beginning of cognitive mechanics. That feedback loop, basically, that system, because they're willing to look at any evidence, guess what? Their TI child can come to any conclusion. This is why INFJs think crystals have magic in them. This is, like as an example, this is why INFJs are often involved with the occult or mysticism or spirituality or different belief systems, very fringe, taboo belief systems even. It's because they're willing to sit down and consider any evidence, which just triggers their ENFP golden pairs, because their golden pairs are like, their T child is like, that evidence is literally worthless. Why are you spending so much time looking at worthless evidence? You are arriving to the wrong conclusions and thinking that things are true because the evidence that you are processing, those abstract facts that you're looking at, are so abstract, so they're not technically facts, I guess. Those abstract factoids, I guess you could call them, I'm sorry, but you're wrong, and you're always going to think about things incorrectly. Here's some abstract facts that are actually handled in a responsible manner, and to get you thinking about the proper things so you actually can arrive to the concrete conclusions. So an INFJ is literally just a data processor, but the problem is if you leave them on their own to gather up their own evidence, to gather up their own input, they're going to fail. That's why they need the TE user around them to help them. Yes, TE Trickster can be helpful because a lot of evidence and input that an INFJ can gather, there's a 50-50 chance, right, in general, that evidence could be good evidence versus bad evidence, right? It could be collected well, or it could have not have been collected well. There's a 50-50 chance. So ultimately, TI is still able to get through it. And the other advantage of TI child is that it's a child and it doesn't run out of energy. A TI parent does run out of energy. And a TI child, because it doesn't run out of energy, it can keep nitpicking, and it will eventually nitpick everything and re-verify everything it already knows anyway to make sure that it still is true. This is why TI child can still ultimately arrive at the most divine level of truth, but it's also for that same reason that their TI can be heavily corrupted. And that's why an INFJ or an ISFJ can be insanely dogmatic. A dogmatic IFJ is a corrupt TI child with the wrong input, right? So what they end up having to do is they have to keep listening to new input, even input that would disagree with their TI child, and keep listening to new input and not close themselves off so as to guarantee that their TI child stays pure, okay, within this cognitive orbit. It's absolutely important. It is critical to have that. Purity of TI child literally means listening to things that they either don't want to do or things that make them uncomfortable, and then spending the time to actually verify if that's true. And then they can adjust themselves as a result. They have to keep doing this over and over and over. If they don't do that, well, then they're going to become ignorant, and then their TI is going to be corrupt, and they're going to think it's okay to rob a store on behalf of somebody else. They're going to think it's okay to be a prostitute for someone else's sake, which I've met INFJs that way, and oh my gosh, that was a scary time in my life. Glad I'm not doing that anymore. Being around those people, ugh, that was so bad. The story is that I was on a dating app one time, and and she ended up actually being a prostitute, and I had no thanks. Can be thing, but you know, with TI child though, you got to be careful because you can easily manipulate a TI child by pre-programming them. Uh, so that can be a problem. I don't having some drop frames right now. All right, I have successfully restarted the stream, so that should improve the stream health. All right, cool. So yeah, so these are all examples of how cognitive orbit actually works when it comes to TI versus TE. And in order for TI to be effective in arriving to the actual concrete facts, the truth, basically, it still requires to have, good input. Some people, like the TE users, when they need to use their orbit to gather evidence first before they allow themselves to think something is true, right? That's the first example of cognitive orbit. Then there are the TI users who already think they know what is true and will only gather evidence that supports what they already know. And that is what pisses off TE users all the time, because TE users are like, well, hold the phone. You didn't gather enough evidence. I go out of my way to gather evidence before I allow myself to think something is true. You, TI users, only gather evidence to support what you already think is true. That is bias, okay? All TI users do that. All of them do that. Luckily, I'm TI parent, and I do that the least because I'm responsible. I am so glad I have TI parent. So thankful that I have TI parent. I could not imagine living as a TI inferior. I could not imagine doing that. And being that, I couldn't. And I'm not begging on TI inferiors when I say that, but I could see how a lot of TE users see a TI inferior as an intellectual burden on them, where they're constantly having to provide evidence to that TI inferior just to help take care of that TI inferior, that TI infant person. And it's a thing. And this is why TE users consistently say that TI users are ignorant, or why they're biased, or how they they rely on last known input or preferred input, basically. And all TI users do this. The more responsible TI user, the less they actually do this. And over time, though, a TI inferior can end up, through aspiration, becoming the absolute most responsible when it comes to truth, but it takes an entire lifetime for them to get there, because they're able to actually access their superego's demon angelic power, basically through their infant function via cognitive orbit, to make it the absolute strongest and even stronger than a TI parent. It can happen. An example of this is using the first orbit, which is SI versus SE. I'm able to access my ESFP superego performance and interest-based capabilities to use that to strengthen my SI into SI aspirational, such that I'm able to access those energies mentally to become the super strong SI user, to the point where no one can out-endure me and no one can out-persevere me, no one can out-suffer me, and I will always be the last man standing, right? So that's another example of that. And you can see examples of that cognitive orbit in the movie Ender's Game with Harrison Ford, especially looking at the fight between one of the team leaders and the main character, Ender Wiggin, who is an ENTP, and he's literally accessing his SE demon to strengthen his SI inferior's suffering, etc., to persevere. And he's able to defeat his enemy while also removing his enemy's opportunities for any future potential conflict by basically making sure the enemy has no ability to retaliate. That's an example of the SI, SE, SI inferior to SE demon cognitive orbit, right? That's how it goes. So, and yes, as Helen Shang says, it is a form of stubborn. So, So willpower is always just finding a pathway forward, a way to escape. It's like being an escape artist. NI willpower is like being an escape artist. An NI inferior, an ESTP using its cognitive orbit to become an escape artist, where it uses the NE demon's capability through the ENFP superego to always create an opportunity for its NI inferior to escape any situation, right? ESTPs are amazing at being escape artists. It's unbelievable. They are always able to free themselves every single time, and that's why, provided their NI is aspirational. Up until that point, their NI is often in shackles, and that can be a problem. So be aware of that. So we're kind of getting a little bit off topic here because it's supposed to be about TE versus TI in this third orbit, basically. But in general, understand that that's how these two different approaches go. The high TE users go out of the way to gather evidence first and they end up gathering evidence first before they allow themselves to come to a true conclusion. The TI users are verifying evidence, basically. Verifying evidence because they're trying to find the value in the evidence. They're trying to find the FI in the evidence, basically, and they'll throw it out if there is no. So they're processing that evidence, basically. The thing is that oftentimes when they're able to use their logic, they only want to find the evidence that supports their views. So technically, this is why a TI user or a TE user is technically more open-minded than a TI user, because TI users are prone to being stubborn. And this is why I say technically the ENFP out of all the 16 types is the most open-minded of all the types. But that open-mindedness is absolutely necessary because that's how we as a race gain forgiveness. Because an ENFP, through its wise INFJ shadow, its FE critic, as well as its everlasting sympathy, and we'll talk about this in the next episode. It literally can find grace and forgiveness literally for anybody, and which is important because we're going to need that before we as a race are completely tossed away in the fire. So that's kind of how it goes. Can you be stuck in a TI-TE loop? So guys, that's the end of this lecture. Thanks for watching. We're going to go into our Q&A mode now, but please keep the questions related to this lecture. Can you be stuck in a TI-TE loop? Absolutely you can, but not in the same way that cognitive looping is generally understood. It's more of like me as a TI parent, I'm not willing to go forward until I absolutely have the correct evidence, because my TE critic is forcing me to gather evidence so that I know for a fact that what my TI parent believes is true or knows is true is actually true. And then it can get in the way, and it can lead to stagnation sometimes because I can get an analysis paralysis. It's no different than, like, say, for example, an INTJ or an ISTJ. They get stuck gathering evidence to come to a true conclusion, and sometimes they've already gathered enough evidence, but for some reason they doubt that they have enough evidence, and they keep gathering evidence and more evidence and more evidence, and then they get stuck in gathering the evidence, and they're not willing to accept that what they already know is true. That's the other direction, in terms of the third cognitive orbit. Okay. What was that about TI child pre-programming? I cut it out for that. Okay, so TI child pre-programming basically is what you do is that you completely control the input that the TI child has. It's where you're preventing the TI child from gathering its own evidence, and the TI child is completely dependent on you gathering evidence for it. The TI child is outsourced the evidence gathering to another person, and which effectively allows the other person to control the life of the TI child. Completely control them. I've seen it happen multiple times for ISFJs and INFJs. And ISFJs, my typical go-to argument is like how church and being in a church group and the social norms of a church group and like a church cult, etc., like my mother, all of that input was being controlled by the TE child's ENFP pastor, and she basically wasn't thinking for herself because she was outsourcing all of her input in terms of her dogma and how she was living her life as a result of somebody else's input that they were choosing to give her, and that input benefited her because they knew that she would think about things in a certain way that would benefit them. Another way to look at it is the feminine primary social order has conditioned men in such a way where it is limiting certain input, certain truths to be, certain evidences to be known to men. It's kind of like book burning, so that those TI child men can only arrive to conclusions that will ultimately force them to continue to be subservient to the feminine primary social order. That is an example of pre-programming TI child by literally controlling and being the gatekeeper of the input. ENFPs do this all the time. ESFPs do this all the time, but it's especially bad with ENFPs. Even INFPs do it. But ENFPs, I've seen it done the most, where they like to put themselves in a position as gatekeeper, and they filter in all of the information between the people beneath them and the people above them, and they end up being able, since they are an information nexus, they end up being able to control people above them and people below them simultaneously, and they eventually are able to be in the positions of power over both parties because they're the one who controls which information is known by who, basically, which is really, really dark and fucked up, if you ask me. So, all right. So to get out, need more info. Yeah, you have to be willing, if you're a TI child and you're concerned that you're being pre-programmed, you have to, in order to see the light being the truth, in order to see the light, you have to be willing to risk the dark, which means, like my mother would have to be willing to go listen to other things that is not typical to the input, the preferred input that she is comfortable to receive from my ENFP former pastor, etc. That's how you, on the way out, it literally comes down to verify and verify everything with your TI. By verifying, trust what they say, but always verify. That's how you get out of it. So yeah. So an INFJ needs others to arrive at the truth of TI, yet should not be around others if those others have bad morals. That's not exactly what I'm saying. Just verify. Okay, so you have to look for new external sources to verify, not just one source. Also very true. Yeah, awesome. Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in right now. And I think we're doing pretty good here otherwise. So yeah, folks, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, Season 18, Cognitive Mechanics, the third orbit, TE to TI, extroverted thinking to introverted thinking, rationale to logic or logos. Based on that, thank you all for watching this month's live lecture. For those of you who are members, if you want to become a member, please become a member at csjoseph.life/members, and that would be awesome if you guys would join us next month for the next episode. If you're receiving this by email, awesome. If you're missing some episodes in season 18 because you don't have the link, you can actually watch all of them at our portal, csjoseph.life/portal, but you have to be a journeyman member in order to access the season 18 content specifically. So anyway, I hope you folks found this useful and helpful in your lives, and that's awesome. So anywho, with all that being said, folks, I'll see you guys tonight.